A crisis is a tipping point. Its origin is the Greek word krino, meaning to separate, judge, or decide. In the 15th century, it came into use in English to describe the climax of a disease after which a patient either recovers or doesn't. Historically, the sovereign determines what constitutes a crisis, and the sovereign controls and manages the response. When the sovereign declares an event a crisis, it reveals that it is the sovereign who is experiencing the crisis. Their aim is their own recovery. What they aim to recover is the legitimacy of their authority. The revelations of widespread sexual abuse in the Catholic Church constitute a crisis for the authority of the papacy. But that's not what it is for survivors. It is a global catastrophe. Catastrophes are incalculable. They cannot be regulated under the conditions in which they were created. In his essay on the concept of history, Walter Benjamin describes a painting by Paul Klee called Angelus Novus. He writes, "It shows an angel who seems about to move away from something he stares at. His eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how the angel of history must look. His face is turned toward the past, where a chain of events appears before us. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise and has got caught in his wings. It is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. The storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows toward the sky." The clergy abuse catastrophe is not the result of an external perversion of the Church, but rather a phenomenon inscribed into its very functioning as a social institution. When the Church defends itself against these crimes, it is defending its most obscene secret. The exposure of this secret triggered a crisis. But is it enough to reverse a catastrophe?
I grew up north of Milwaukee in a very Catholic ethnic community. The church, Catholicism, our parish, was my life. And we also, especially on my father's side, had a lot of priests and sisters, just a ton of vocations on my dad's side of the family. I was ordained in 1990 as a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and then I left officially I left temporarily in 2005, and I left officially in 2007.
So I was raised in a big Catholic family. We were very devout Catholics. We'd go to Mass, multiple times a week, sometimes every day. I really wanted to do something with my faith when I finished high school. I had a sort of grandiose, idealistic idea of the church as this force in society that was going to promote renewal, that was going to help people when they were at their most vulnerable and most broken. It was something that made me extremely enthusiastic and zealous. I thought that the path of Catholicism was the path to genuine human fulfillment. And I thought that I would sacrifice anything to be a part of something so important. And the meaning that had for me eventually went up against the actual reality of how the church actually operates and the people and forces inside the church that make it what it is. And I realized quite quickly that my dream of serving this sort of grandiose mission was not going to be the reality of what priesthood was.
The better question is, why did I stay? Rather than, why did you get in? Because that's the challenge in that type of life. Once you're in, when you start realizing what's really going on, and you either adapt to it and thrive, or you don't thrive and get out. When I entered, it was an honorable profession. It was looked upon with respect. And we didn't know, most people on the outside knew nothing of any of the corruption that went on the inside. It was covered in a deep, deep layer of secrecy.
Even though my journey evolved out of priesthood, I came out as a gay man, and it's been public, now that I was sexually abused as a kid, which I think was shocking and scary for people. But I'm really fortunate because I still have so many people who are still friends. So the priest who abused me, his name was Father Richard Nichols. Even in his first assignment, he was caught sexually abusing a kid in the school. And so the priests that he was with, of course, they didn't deal with it. So his pattern was that he moved every couple of years from parish to parish to parish, all because, the pastor wasn't dealing with the fact he's sexually abusing these kids. It was back in the days of Archbishop Weakland, and so Father Nichols asked permission to be able to go to Marquette University to get a doctorate in psychology and to become a child psychologist. And he got that permission, even though there had been complaints about him that the diocese knew about. He was best friends with my dad's cousin, and he had Thursdays off. And because they were so close, he had gotten to know our family in Belgium, Wisconsin, where I grew up. So on Thursdays in summer, Father Nichols would actually come and visit and spend the day. I remember it was in the summer of 1976 when I met him, because, the kids were like, oh, this Father Nichols, and, he's a Catholic priest. So what greater thing for parents, to have their kids around. Father Nichols would take us kids, both boys and girls, in his car and go to Port Washington for ice cream, because in our hometown there was really nothing to do. Or he'd take us swimming in Random Lake. And now, years later, I see the cultivation that went on, because I remember he smoked a pipe. And as kids in the car away from our parents, he would let us smoke a pipe, which we as kids were like, whoa, this is super naughty. We knew it was super naughty, but it was kind of cool. And it was kind of our little secret with him. He asked if I wanted to go along for a camping trip up near Wautoma, Wisconsin. His family had a trailer. So I went along with actually two younger cousins of mine who were 2 years younger. Father Nichols took us to this trailer that his family owned on it's a strange little lake called Beans Lake. But I remember the first day we unpacked our stuff. The lake was not much more than a mud hole, so it wasn't a great place to swim. But he took us some places locally. We went out to dinner. And then I remember it was that night, and there were 3 areas to sleep. And I was in one alone. The two younger kids were together in that, and then Father Nichols had his own place. And I remember that I had just gone to sleep, and all of a sudden Father Nichols came in, and I was kind of startled. And what I'll never forget is there was actually starting to rain and thunder and lightning. He came in, and that's when the first episode of sexual abuse happened. And, for me as a kid, it was the first time anyone ever performed oral sex on me. And so it was, and he was probably 45 years old and a big guy, strong, man or whatever. And I remember the mixed feelings sort of pleasure, because this had never really happened before, but almost pain, and just the unknown. He also would take his finger and put his finger up my butt as a way of, I guess, thinking he was somehow pleasuring me when he's really basically pleasuring himself. And I just remember being in shock, my body just, stopping as all this is going on, and almost out of body. I just feel I'm looking down at myself and not knowing, what to make of all of it. And I remember laying there just kind of, so afraid, and this storm is going on. And then one of the worst parts for me that first night was I was always a very responsible kid. And I thought, is he going to do this? The kids' names were Brian and the other one was Charles. We call him Chucky. Like, is he going to do this to them? And I felt like I'm the responsible kid there. And as I laid there kind of listening, like, is he going to go in by them and do this stuff to them? I really thought to myself, I can't let this happen. And when I think of what I went through, not just the sexual abuse part, but one piece that was almost more painful for me later on is I decided that night that I'd stay up as long as I could. And if he went into that room and did that I was going to get a knife and kill him. And I played in my head, like, if I kill this guy, the police are going to come. What are mom and dad going to do? Am I going to get out of jail? So I'm like ruminating this stuff. And I remember staying up as long as I could. And then I finally fell asleep. And the next morning, I just wanted to get the hell out of there. But there's no cell phones. I don't even really know exactly where we are. He drives the car. You know, I'm just like a kid. So I remember being very distant from him. Like, I just shut down. I didn't even talk. And again, here's a man with a doctorate in psychology who's a trained psychologist. And I remember him, you know, very much like playing up to me a little bit, trying to tease me a little bit to come around. And sadly, that was a week that we spent with him. Every single night that I was there, this sexual abuse, you know, would unfold for me. When he drove us home, I couldn't wait to get home. Like, I couldn't wait to get away from him. And he dropped me off at my parents' house, and my parents were like, you know, so happy to see me, and they couldn't thank, you know, Father Nichols enough. And then I'll never forget, my dad was like, well, Father, would you like to go out to dinner with us yet tonight? We'd love to take you out to dinner to thank you for taking Kevin along. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, we have to go to dinner with him now? So I remember the exact restaurant. It was a local restaurant, supper club, where we went. If I went in there today, I could tell you where we sat, who sat around the table. It's that vivid. I just remember there too, like out of body. Like, I think it must have just been my defense mechanism, you know, psychologically. Like, they were all talking, and I just felt like I was watching this all unplay from above. When we got home, he left, and I was a kind of a very affective, emotional kid. So I just burst out crying after he left. And my mom and dad, you know, they were like so happy to see me, and I seemed okay or whatever. And I remember my parents saying, like, what's the matter, you know? And I just kept saying it was terrible. And again, growing up in the community I did in that era, I wouldn't even have words. Like, today I'd have the words to express what happened, but, you know, even just talking about the acts that were, you know, perpetrated against me, I just, at that point in my life, I couldn't even put that into words, oral sex, any of these things. It just wasn't a part of my experience of vocabulary. I remember my dad pushing it because I was just like hysterically crying. And he's like, well, did he hit you? Like, they thought, you know, like maybe he was mean to me or like physically whatever. And I'm like, no, 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 no. And it took my parents, who again, I think are kind of naive rural people who adored priests and worshiped a priest on a pedestal, and a priest could do no wrong, and our family's filled with clergy, for my dad to be like, well, did he like touch you? You know, inappropriately, like down. I mean, my dad was just like trying to get this out. You know, we've never talked about things like this. And I finally told him yes. And I remember my dad, especially, my mom just wept, and my dad was just so angry, you know. And then my dad's like, we got to talk to the bishop about this or whatever. And I remember we're in a small town, super Catholic. I remember we have a great aunt who never married, who was like more Catholic than the Pope. We've got Father Jerome, another priest who's a first cousin, all of this. And I remember just freaking out at the thought of that and saying to, you know, like, if you say anything, I'm going to run away. And both my parents kind of went to their grave with this regret, like that they didn't do enough. And I said, you know, at the time, we had no power whatsoever, and they were so concerned about me. Like, if they did tell, they didn't know what to do. So sadly for them, they took it to their grave, this feeling that they didn't do right by me. And I said to them, we were the victims, me, you. So don't put any guilt or shame on yourself. We were victimized. Don't hold on to that.
At no point that I can recall were victims ever upheld as brave for coming forward, as heroic. they weren't even necessarily upheld as people deserving sympathy or compassion for having undergone something horrible. They were spoken of very matter-of-factly and hardly addressed at all. While I might know the names of offender priests at that time, I certainly couldn't have named victims. And I do remember at specific events, there would be survivors, usually with the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, SNAP, who would stand out in front of the cathedral or the church. It might be for an ordination or something, holding signs. And I remember one instructor telling us to stay away from them, that they were the enemy, that they hated the church. And there was no acknowledgement really, even that they were struggling or that they were people who had undergone great pain. Instead, it was just, this is all in the past. We've instituted reforms now that we're proud of, that no institution has ever instituted to respond to abuse, is what they said. And so victims were not a part of any education that we had about abuse in the Catholic Church.
It was the way in that era, which came pretty close to where we are now, where this deference toward the institutional church. By the institutional church, I mean the governmental structure, the bishops, not the people. Because if there was concern about the real church, the primary value would be the welfare of the victim and their family. But it's the other way around. But it was like diplomatic immunity. They have an immunity because they're Catholic priests and they're associated with the Catholic Diocese of Chicago or Milwaukee. And if you had a devout Catholic prosecuting attorney or district attorney, it made it even worse.
So I remember it was the next Thursday because it was still summer. I was home alone, and who comes to our door but Father Richard Nichols? And the door is locked. And there was no way in heck I was going to let him in, okay? I'm just feeling so much fear and all that rush of emotion and, again, kind of going out of my head. And I remember talking to Father Nichols through this door. And, again, we're dealing with a man who's a psychologist with children. And it was all this stuff like, I'm so sorry, I want to talk to you, I'm sorry about what happened, all this stuff. And here I am, this 13-year-old trusting Catholic kid. Okay, So I opened the door, and Father Nichols came into our home, talked for a while, and I was sexually assaulted another time in the same way in our family's home when my parents and my brother are at work. And when that happened, I really fought him off this time. And I did say to him that, my parents knew, and he just lost it, okay? He just blew up and said, you better keep your mouth shut, all this stuff. And then he said to me, you're coming with me. He pressured me, forced me, was, raising his voice or whatever, intimidating me. And I went into his car, which I could describe that car to a T today. And we got in the car, and I thought, he is going to kill me. We drove on, you get Belgium, Wisconsin, Highway D to what is now Harrington Beach State Park. We didn't go to the state park, but you can drive down right to the lake, and it's like a public beach and boat landing. And I remember driving past my church where I grew up, which I'm very sentimental about because, as I say, my family's been there forever. It's an ethnic church. And Father Nichols is intimidating me about talking. And I looked at my church, and my little parochial school that I had gone to was there. And I tried to think into the church, the statue of Mary, because we were always devoted to Mary. And I just kind of prayed and said, Mary, you've got to save me, because I thought this man would kill me. We got down to where the beach was. I opened the door. I ran as fast as I could to get away from him. So here we have it, me running down the beach, and Father Nichols is chasing behind me, a 40-some-year-old man. And I remember him tackling me on the beach in the town of Belgium and holding me down. He's like, what the hell is wrong with you? And he'd say fuck a lot, too. It's the first time I ever heard that word. What the fuck? What the fuck? And I said to him, you're not going to kill me. And he's like, you stupid, shit, I'm not going to kill you. He kind of held me for a while, and all of a sudden he got up and started walking away, and I was so relieved, he's not going to kill me. So I started walking the other direction. I thought, I can walk a few miles home. I don't care. I just don't want to be near him. Well, he said, get the fuck over here. And I got back into the car with him, and I'll never forget my last encounter with him. He dropped me off, not in our driveway, but at the front, like by the driveway of our house, in front of our house. And his last words were, "You better keep your mouth fucking shut."
I think many people who are devout and don't want to confront the reality of abuse in the Catholic Church are clinging to a fantasy version of the church that is very necessary for their own faith, because it's very difficult to confront evil like this, especially when it's in your backyard, when it's in the place that is most precious to you as a devout believer. And so some simply, I think, choose to just not confront it at all, which is unfortunate. They know that those stories are out there, but they don't seek them out. They don't read about it. They let it just wash over them rather than sink in and realize, well, no, this is talking about your church. This is talking about your community, even like your diocese. It's your bishop who's not cooperating with the Attorney General investigation. It's not just some other person out there that has nothing to do with you. It's the church you believe in. That's the church you donate your time and money to. It's a hard thing to hear that that organization is involved in these sorts of crimes. And I guess some Catholics would rather just not confront that. So when I was joining the seminary, so many of the priests who were recruiting for the seminary came of age and became priests during the years of the papacy of John Paul II. John Paul II was worshipped by these priests. He was an icon of not only saintliness and holiness, but of masculinity, values and ideals and moral character. He went skiing, he went on canoe trips, and he championed this idea of new evangelization, of that, well, the gospel has been heard around the world at this point, but they saw the forces of like secular society and the diminishing role of the church in public life as a bad thing. And the way to readjust it was to recatechize Catholics who were Catholic already, but didn't necessarily have a firm grasp on what their church even believed.
My job when I went to the Vatican Embassy was going to be managing the investigative process for candidates for being bishop, which was a process that's still covered in 28 layers of secrecy. The candidates' names would be given to me. I'd send letters out of inquiry to different people. I would run a big background check, and I would get the different candidates. Then I'd have to summarize that. If there were problems, I had to bring those problems to my boss, bring the problems to him and say, this guy's not going to fly. And he'd say, you're right, he's not, so pull his name. John Paul II was retrogressive. He was going backwards. So what we had, I saw this list with the criteria that was given to my boss, and then we had questionnaires with about 40 questions. And the basic criteria were, first part was orthodoxy. Their orthodoxy in matters of birth control, homosexuality, marriage of priests and women priests. You had to have the right answers on those issues to start with. Personal loyalty to the Pope. Is he personally loyal to the person of the Holy Father and to the Holy See? Okay. Then you went down the line. Appearance was a big thing. You know, has he got any physical defects? Does he stutter? Anything like this? That was important. And then his moral life. And they had to write it up so that the guy walked on water, and that there was nothing in his background that could ever be questioned or would ever cause a problem. Most of it was administrators, canon lawyers, guys who were friends of the bishop that promoted them. That's how they got there. So they reproduced themselves. This first generation that I was responsible for creating was the first JP2 type bishops, very doctrinaire, very loyal. The Holy Father this, the Holy Father that. They were like robots. And then they, of course, reproduced themselves. And they started picking out their type of guys that thought like them and promoting them. So we're now in the third wave of that.
John Paul II is still treated as the greatest saint of modern times, as one of the most important historical figures, even regardless of his status as Pope. So when stories emerge, and I'm sure many will still emerge, are still to come, about the degree to which John Paul II actively, in many ways, facilitated the abuse of children in the church, there is complete denial in some quarters about that. People just simply refuse to hear that, because John Paul II is upheld as such an incredible figure.
So I got this letter, and it was from the Vicar General of the Diocese of Lafayette, Louisiana, announcing to us that they had been involved with 6 families whose sons, which amounted to 9 sons, with sexual abuse by this one priest, Gilbert Gauthier. The boss said to me, we've settled with these families, and they've all signed confidentiality agreements, so everything's okay. It won't come out in the public. Nobody will know anything about it. The church is safe. That's a key word. The church is safe. And then he said to me, we're going to have to ask the Pope to make an appointment of a temporary investigator. What you need to do is write a report describing what this is. I said, okay. So I wrote a 42 or 44 page report in English, and it was in detail, it was graphic, and it explained the cover-up and the violence to the kids. And I wrote it in a language that they would understand, not knowing who the they were going to be. Well, it turns out the they was JP2, John Paul II. And the boss decided that it had to go directly to him, and he had to find a way to get it to go directly to him. And we happened to know that Cardinal Kroll from Philadelphia, who was tight with the Pope because they're both Polish. And Kroll gave him a lot of money, so that opens a lot of doors. And I was on good terms with Kroll. So I called him up, and he said, if you can get that thing to me by Sunday night, I'm flying over on Monday, and I'll have it in the Pope's hands by Tuesday. And I will report back to you after he's read it. Pretty good, okay. My boss signed it without making any changes. And you couldn't miss the point. You know, you could not miss the point with this. So Kroll gets it, flies to Rome. But the second hour he's there, he goes to see the Pope. And he gave it to him and told him this is a serious problem. You know, do it, do something. So by Thursday, we got a cable telling us that this bishop was appointed to try to straighten out the mess. That's when I began to turn. All he wants to do is figure ways to keep this out of the public and keep it secret. And I said to myself, that's not what he's there for. You know, he's there to do the right thing and to see how these kids are doing, to make sure they're getting care. He said, well, he hasn't met any of the kids because he doesn't want to meet the families. That's the Vatican way of fixing problems.
So I joined in 2013. So at that point, everyone knew about it. It had been out for at least 10 years, if you go back to the Boston Globe story in 2002. I had heard many of the stories about it, and like many other Catholics, I think, I just believed that it was something that had already happened and been dealt with. And if it was still going on to any degree, it was just like individual psychologically damaged priests who were doing this that, you know, hopefully would be brought to justice or would be caught. Within the seminary, there was a very interesting way they approached the story of the abuse crisis. I never really heard any priest actually like take real responsibility for it in any way. Never spoke of it in terms of like, this was like a thing that people did in the church on purpose that they should never have done. It's always spoken instead of like, it's a crisis. It's like, you know, water in the dam broke and we got to fix our failing infrastructure. Or it's just mistakes were made, errors were made, like typos, rather than like, no, decisions were made by people who coordinated this, who got together and made this happen and are continuing to make this happen. There was never any discussion of it on those terms. I remember it was shortly before we were to begin at the seminary. A good friend of mine was also joining, and we had recently heard about someone at that seminary who left very suddenly under strange circumstances. And what the rumor was is that there was some sort of like inappropriate conduct, as they would say, between another seminarian and him. And that was like a first kind of like point, like, well, all these people in the seminary are not necessarily like wholly devout people. A lot of them are like grooming other men for sex within the seminary. And so I remember speaking with him, like, I guess I never really thought of that. I thought it was kind of like, I don't know, I guess there's bad people everywhere. You got to be careful is what we said. And so I remember discussing with him, like, I guess we'll keep our eyes out as we go and like, hopefully, there's none of that going on there, because this is a new seminary. The building I was there the second year that the building had been built. And so we thought, well, this is the new batch of priests. This is the new evangelization priests. And while it doesn't mean that they're perfect or anything, it means that, surely they've taken steps to, make sure that that sort of behavior is not encouraged or taking place at all. What I found at St. Joe's, as we called it, was quite the opposite, is that there was a lot of predatory behavior towards seminarians exhibited by people all over the Catholic Church, because we interacted with priests and bishops everywhere. One seminarian told me on a trip to Washington, D.C., he kind of took me aside, and he said, we're going to meet Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. He's the Cardinal of D.C. You'll probably get a chance to talk to him a little bit and shake his hand. Here's a cigarette. You should smoke a cigarette first. And I was like, why? And he said, well, the story is that Ted McCarrick really doesn't like smokers, so he's not going to be creepy to you or hit on you or try to sleep with you if he can smell that you're a smoker. I heard that in 2014. And at that point, when I heard that, I wish I could say I was surprised, but I'd already been in for a few months and heard a lot of stories like that. And I knew that the facade that the church kind of put up about all the reform and all the renewal that they've done was just that. It was a facade. And that powerful people were allowed to continue to engage in predatory behavior, even on a really exceptional scale like Theodore McCarrick, with very little accountability. And in fact, people like Theodore McCarrick at that time were upheld as, celebrity priests, essentially. It was a great honor still that we would get to meet someone like him, despite the fact that it was a known secret that he is preying on other seminarians. I've never heard someone actually genuinely try to reconcile the Saint John Paul II with the John Paul II who ignored the victim of Theodore McCarrick, the John Paul II who enabled Maciel. Any bishop or priest that is, abused between the years of 1978 and 2004, that happened under him. How many bishops were made bishops with a paper trail of them having to be pulled from ministry and go to rehabilitation centers because of allegations against them? As I've talked about the sort of John Paul II generation of priests, there was a renewed focus on celibacy and chastity, and in some ways in response to the abuse crisis, which I think they view more as an issue of chastity and less of one of, criminality. And in my experience, the way that chastity and celibacy is spoken of by priests to seminarians can get very dangerous, because it's a way for offender priests to have vulnerable seminarians open up about their sexuality, and it gets them to talk about their sexual preferences and orientation and their masturbation habits and the porn that they watch and the guilt that they feel about those activities. And for offender priests, it's a great way for them to scope out territory in a way. They know, well, this person is struggling because they're, for example, they might be a homosexual seminarian who feels very conflicted about that, and they're not sure what they want to do about that. If you're a priest, a predator priest, that is someone that you can target because they're vulnerable and they opened up to you. You hold their secret now, and you can exploit that against them. I have seen so many priests that have promoted chastity end up, say, getting arrested for possession of child pornography, and priests that promote the beauty of celibacy as, I'm just like Jesus when I'm abstaining from sex like this, and the priestly lifestyle of chastity is this holy spiritual life. I've seen those same priests engage in predatory behavior towards other people in the church, towards children. I think that a lot of that is, again, a convenient smokescreen for their real predilections and what they really want to achieve.
Celibacy is made mandatory and then is glorified, so you got to convince the guys to accept it. If you read books about it, the history of it, and if you look at some of the things John Paul II said, the at one point they referred to celibacy as the jewel in the crown of the priesthood. And the issue, I think, wasn't if you were a priest and you were leading a celibate life, you took the vows or accepted it, and you were not, you weren't going to get married, you weren't dating, so you took it out naturally on children. Well, that doesn't follow, because being celibate doesn't give you a psychosexual disorder. You may have one, but celibate or not, you're going to act out. So that is something a lot of people think, that if you eliminate celibacy, nobody's going to want to abuse kids. Well, that's not the case, because the biggest sexual abusers of children are married men. What is it about celibacy that has something to do with sexual abuse? And I think there's a lot. I think it's the attitude that we're superior beings because we're celibate. It's like clerical dress. It sets you aside, and it makes you, and I've had this articulated to me by lay people, you guys must be really powerful and strong not to have sex. And so there's that mystique. The other thing is it keeps the clerical culture removed and therefore safe. At least they think it's safe. Because that's an area where the biggest amount of secrecy exists is around the sexual lives of clerics. Rectories, monasteries, there's areas you can't go into unless you're one of the insiders. One of the big problems is that priests would take young boys to their bedrooms in the rectories and do all sorts of things to them. Other priests would see it and say nothing. And that's one of the biggest problems, because a lot of rectories, a lot of monasteries have unwritten rule or a written rule. Nobody goes into the private quarters of the monks or the priests. And then the best part is this term that JP2 used to use, the ontological change. When I'm ordained, I experience an ontological change. Ontos, Greek word for being. It means my very being is changed. I walk out of that church, I'm not a human anymore. I don't know what the hell I am, but I'm a priest, so I'm ontologically changed. I never bought that line. And in a lot of the research I've done to try to illustrate how the institution itself collaborates with sexual abuse, makes it possible. It nurtures sexual abuse because of the image of the priesthood. And part of that is this myth about this ontological change. JP2 used to use the term, you're conjoined to Jesus Christ when you're ordained. This attitude of the superior nature of the priesthood. Where that came from, in reality, was the French, there's a school of spirituality in France that goes back to the 16th century. After the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, there was a reaction because they wanted to restore the priesthood, they wanted to restore the church. Of course, it had been trampled by the French, the government and the people. And one of them was to create this mystique about priests, when they're ordained, they actually take into themselves part of the personality and the person of Jesus Christ. There was a Dominican at the Angelicum teaching theology named Marie-Joseph Lagrange, and he was really into this stuff heavily. One of his pupils was John Paul II, who bought it hook, line, and sinker. And he believed all that crazy spirituality of the priesthood. So he becomes Pope, and he starts talking about it. And I never knew the word ontological change until then. I never heard it in the seminary. It was never taught to us. All we were ever told about the priesthood was that it's like baptism. It puts an indelible mark on your soul, that once you're ordained, you're always ordained. Even if you leave, if you're laicized, no matter what happens, you're always theoretically a priest. So that was where a lot of that came from. JP2 picks it up. He wants to restore the priesthood to its former glory pre-Vatican II, and he starts writing these letters to priests on Holy Thursday, and they're flowery and they're exalted, and you're conjoined to Jesus and blah, blah, blah. It's all because of this ontological change, which only goes back to the 16th century. Beyond that, St. Thomas didn't talk about it. There's nothing in Gratian, in the early canon law, nothing.
The theology of the body approach that John Paul II emphasized, it definitely believes or speaks of abstaining from sex for the sake of a celibate religious vocation as a higher calling in a way that is almost like its own form of sexual fulfillment. And that was something that I always found very strange, because I wasn't sure how abstaining from sex could possibly bring that about. And it's always explained very spiritually that it's like, well, Christ is the bridegroom of the church, and the church is the bride, and so you are in the person of Christ, and the church is your bride, and you are in a romantic relationship with the church, and like it is the height of romance to be a Catholic priest and celebrate Mass. And in a way, it was almost as if like being a priest was its own form of like sexual gratification. They're trying to recruit young men to engage in a life that on paper means they never have sex. They emphasize that it's like, well, it is its own form of fulfillment. It's not a denial of your sexual faculties. It's a higher use of them, is absolutely the language that they like to use. They don't necessarily want to be really negative and just emphasize that you aren't having sex. Instead, they emphasize that like, no, I'm using my sexuality in a higher way by serving the church. The sacrifice of it makes it like you're like Christ. And Christ became man. Christ had a body and presumably had a sexuality, but he didn't use it, with just one romantic partner. Instead, it's elevated through this strange sacrificial, spiritualized way where he dies and gives his life on the cross. That itself is almost like what the priestly life is this sort of death to self-sacrifice, where you say deny sex, right? That somehow fulfills the meaning and destiny of your sexual faculties. Even the renunciation of enjoyment can itself be a form of enjoyment.
What it is that's prompting this small cadre of young men, and it's very small, it's not that big, who are buying into this traditional approach to the Catholic Church and to the priesthood, and they see celibacy, I think, as contributing to that. And a lot of it is in terms of power. They believe in the ontological stuff. They believe that it's a higher calling to be a celibate priest than a married person. That's still, believe me, for me, an area of a lot of mystery. These guys, they all got this glued-on smile, and they all act the same, look the same, talk the same. And I think there's a lot of romanticism attached to the externals. If you ever have seen pictures of the coronation of Pope Pius XII, take a look at them. It was probably the most elaborate coronation of any king that's happened in the past 1,000 years. And I mean, it was elaborate, it had everything. And the papacy was surrounded by that stuff, immersed in it. Special vestments, all these guys with night suits walking around. And they like the rigidity, they like the ritual. There's something about all of that appeals, the habits, the rigmarole that you wear, the whole social structure, which is monarchical. They have to have kings, so we got these monsignors and so on and so forth. And that goes with that. There are a lot of people, apart from the clerical world, that would love to see the restoration of monarchies because they enjoy all the panoply that goes with it. Now, that was one time part of life. Then it became decoration and not part of life. It became something on top of that. And that's what I think a lot of these people want to go back to.
1977 to 2006, all of that trauma was just, buried in myself, but I survived. I'm really strong and I survived. People often say, well, after that, how could you have become a priest? The church and my faith, as a Catholic, were my life. Like, that was my core. And I was a very talented musician. And it was just at that era that in my little home church, that there was so much trauma, that I was trying to deal with, that for me, my music in church, it sounds crazy to some people, but for me, that was like my lifeline almost to God and healing. And like, a lot of victims blame God and don't believe in God anymore. I've never been that way. Like my faith is not directed by the church any longer, but my faith is just so much bigger than that. And I've never lost that. At that moment of my life, I didn't realize or think that the institution of the church, was behind so much of this and I didn't understand that culture. In a sense, it's like I ran into one really horrible person, but I didn't think or believe that the church could, in a sense, feed into this in an organized, systematic way. And honestly, it took until 2007, stepping out of priesthood, stepping out of that culture, that, clerical, warped culture, that so many priests are just a part of it. It was a part of who I was. And so many Catholics just accept it or don't quite understand it. I had to step out of that to see that what had happened to me was pervasive. It was symptomatic of a very sick institution. And the best decisions I made was to leave the priesthood. It just, for me in my spiritual life, it just does not represent the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think for many other people, and I mean that not in a pious way, but very sincerely, the values that I hold very dear are just not reflected in that institution.
The instructors in the seminary, as far as I can tell, their view of the problem of abuse in the Catholic Church had a lot more to do with the idea that the church was under attack somehow by a hostile press, by a secular world, by an anti-Catholic, secular atheist front. If they were conservative, it was liberal forces in society, and if they were liberal, it was conservative forces in society. But they viewed the church as somehow above all of that and pure in a way. Essentially, the story that they communicated was that the church was under attack and we were there to defend the church, that we were militant soldiers being trained to defend the church from hostile forces that wanted to destroy the church's good works. And so the narrative about abuse got wrapped up in that. One victim shared with me about their meeting with the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, in which they told the Cardinal about their abuse. And throughout the entire meeting, the Cardinal simply nodded. "Are you finished?" he asks. "Are you finished?" The story's finished. They go their separate ways. "No, I'm sorry. No, I know this was a hard conversation." Simply, "Are you finished?" And I think that incident is a pretty telling one. I think that many priests and bishops do have that attitude about victims. They view them as an annoyance, as a frustration to the supposedly good works that the church is otherwise doing. And rather than engaging with them and viewing them as what they are, victims of a horrible crime that the church was complicit in and the church covered up for, they view them as instead people who are attacking the church and hostile or nuisances.
So I contacted Archbishop Dolan, now Cardinal Dolan, and he was shocked, and "I want to come up and talk to you." So he did. And I remember the first meeting was very friendly and, "Oh, Kevin, we all love you," and all this stuff. Everyone's praying for you. But I remember the second meeting, I came out to him about the sexual abuse, and I could see Timothy Dolan's face drop. Okay, he's not very good at hiding his emotions, and he was stunned. I could tell he felt very uncomfortable, and it was a shock to him, which, I can understand. But it was interesting, the relationship definitely changed after that. And I remember I very sincerely asked, "Well, Archbishop, I know with sexual abuse victims, the diocese wants you to contact your sexual assault victim assistance person for the diocese, whatever the title is, I don't remember." And I'm like, should I contact her? I wanted to do the right thing very sincerely. I wasn't holding anything against him. I just wanted to do what was right. And looking back now, his response to me, I feel was really bad, and it was self-serving for him and the diocese, because he was like, well, I would think about that a lot, Kevin. It's your choice, he did say, but if you come back and, and if you told them and that gets out to people, I don't know. And when I think about it, it wasn't a very pastoral or caring response for me, because of course it would have been doing the proper thing. It was more or less, I think, fears he had that people would find out about this. And I was someone who was well known and well respected, so it was kind of self-serving, I'll be honest. And again, the more I got out of the clerical culture, I got to see him and other people and the institution for what it is, and that is often not very authentic. Like, I really gave the best years of my life to the church, and the church meant everything to me and my family. And when I needed my church, they weren't there.
If you're part of an organization or a system or a network, when it's threatened, if the threat comes from inside, you're going to isolate that threat. And if it comes from the outside, you circle the wagons. Because all of a sudden, the institution or the organization takes on a persona of itself. It takes on an entity or identification of its own. And it's not the sum total of all the people in it, but it becomes, like the concept of a corporation is when something like that has to have legal identity, they call it a corporation from the word body. Human beings have rights and obligations. Now you have a non-human entity that has the same thing. This was the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church is the largest denomination on earth. It's the biggest corporation in the world, and it's a monarchy. There was sexual abuse going on throughout history. There's a lot of documentary evidence of that. I started doing the research the way I'd been trained, going backwards. And I kept going till I ended in the 4th century with the Synod of Elvira. And I said, well, this is interesting. This stuff has been going on for a long time. The ecclesiastical world has tried to do anything to shift the blame, to minimize the issue, to shift the blame, and to exonerate themselves, because one reason only, because this seriously, seriously threatens the strength, the image, the prestige, and the power of the ecclesiastical structure. Big time. If you were a cleric and you grew up in that era, you didn't even talk about sex, because that was a sin. The bishops, when they'd communicate with each other, they had a whole string of euphemisms that they'd use. They'd use either Latin words. For example, they'd say, Father has a problem de sexto, D-E-S-E-X-T-O. That didn't refer to not sex, but the 6th commandment. And the 6th commandment, which says, thou shalt not commit adultery, essentially has been interpreted to mean you can't do anything sexual. And they still use that. In the Code of Canon Law today, clerics who are guilty of violating children in violations of the 6th commandment, pretty broad. So the average layperson didn't know what the hell that meant. Or they would use a whole string of, Father has interpersonal problems, he has excessive affection, they have moral issues. The whole terminology for clerics having sex with children was a euphemism. The abominable crime that even God will not forgive. Well, that was sex with kids. And you don't find explicit references to human sexuality in any ecclesiastical documentation. I mean, the male and the female members. Member of what, the Knights of Columbus? No. You know what they're talking about. They're talking about sexual organs. They use them in reports, they use them in letters, in speaking, and they would cover up and minimize what was going on. Well, Father he had some improper touches. Well, when you find out what these improper touches were, they were improper, they were touches, but you call it rape.
The church's position is very secure. And so I think people who are genuinely worried that by allying with law enforcement, say, to hold the church accountable for sexual abuse, if they're genuinely worried that the church will go away and all the good things about the church will go away as a result of that, I think they should just look at the last 2,000 years. It's lasted, and it's very good at lasting. I don't think it's under any real financial threat. Because it's a private institution, and it has religious exemption. They really are able to use their position to make money, and you can argue, yeah, well, as they should, to keep their institutions going and to promote all the good works that they do. But it also then feeds back into just like, it means that when a victim comes forward to the church and reports that they were abused by one of their priests, it means that they can throw some of the best lawyers that money can buy at them and force them to stop and be silent.
They had a playbook that they still use, which is denial, minimization, and there are plenty of instances of civil cases where they would go after the victims. They would investigate the victims. They would try to find something on them or on their parents or on their families. The fact that we have produced as many dysfunctional priests has a lot to do with the training system, with the image of what the priesthood is, with the image of what the church is. No matter how bad you were or what you did, the church would not deprive a priest of his priesthood. They thought that was the greatest gift you could get, and it was so important that no matter what you are, if you join the Gestapo, you can't be deprived. And there were priests in Germany, the brown shirt priests they call them, who were involved in the SS and in the Gestapo and wore the uniforms, and they were not laicized.
Abuse in the Catholic Church is not the result of just individualized weird people who slip through the cracks. Abuse in the Catholic Church is a coordinated project, and it gets difficult at a certain point to talk about a like version of the church or a pure part of the church that doesn't engage in that at all, that like the non-abuse part of the church, because it's the same people who are running so much of it, and who are doing this on purpose. This is planned and coordinated and thought out. It's not like it just happened and we're throwing our hands up in the air. How do we respond to this crisis that just emerged out of nowhere? No, you knew what was happening all along because you've been burying it and covering it up for years and threatening victims and throwing lawyers at them and making them so demoralized and feel so much despair that they kill themselves or overdose on drugs. It's a project of silence that bishops and priests and others who work to cover up abuse intentionally engaged in. And so any bishop today who talks about all of the great reforms that they've instituted, ask them, like, who was there when they were instituting it? The same bishops who covered it up. Why should we simply take their word for it that they've made these reforms when we've seen all along that they haven't? I ultimately realized that to be a priest meant my nose would hit the marble if I were to be ordained, and I would be there prostrate in front of that bishop and give the rest of my life to him. Obedience, he would have complete control over everything. And I looked at my bishop, and, for a while I think, well, if I just make it, I keep my head down, I don't cause too much trouble, I could be part of the reform. I could maybe not at first, right? But I could get to being a pastor, and then I can start making decisions that, I actually have a little bit of power over. But it always gets deferred and always gets pushed down the road of like, well, I'll wait till I'm at a parish. I'll wait till I'm like a pastor. I'll wait till I can like climb up. And I didn't really have ambition to like be a bishop or anything. And the idea of like spending the rest of my life chasing the fleeting chance of being a reformer didn't seem likely. And it seemed instead my nose would hit that marble, I would rise beholden to this man that I had very little respect for because I saw how he had handled the abuse crisis, and I saw that his main interests were financial or avoiding litigation, avoiding the blowback, even just negative press, not healing, not compassion for the victims, not justice for the offenders. I didn't want to be beholden to that.
If you look, in spite of the efforts to integrate lay people into the government, to integrate women into the government of the Catholic Church, the stratification is still there because the top of the heap is still the same. And I think And this may sound insane to people that are heaped. The only way it's going to be different is if you get rid of the monarchy.
The church is set up that the ordained, the clergy, the hierarchy has control, and they don't want to lose that. And that's what the history of the institution has been. It isn't a place that's super collegial or more democratic. It's it's the structure compared to most other mainline Christian churches. The people really have some authority about their church, be it who they select, all of those things. That's not the structure of Catholicism. I'm pretty pessimistic that it can change and that there will be change. I remember being in a meeting with Archbishop Listecki, a woman from the creditors committee who was also a victim, and myself. The diocese was saying, we're not going to release any records because we don't want to hurt you people anymore, which gets me angry to this day. The reason they didn't want to release any more records was not to help me. It wasn't to show pastoral care for me. It was to cover their ass. And we shared our stories and of how we were abused to the Archbishop, and he listened to those stories. And then we said, we're here because releasing those records will help us, okay? We want total transparency. And it was beautiful. The woman I was with said, I am no longer a Roman Catholic. She goes to some Assembly of God church, and she told her horrific story of the abuse at the hands of Donald Mazinski. And she was a very infirmed girl. It was barbaric what she went through, even compared to me. And she shared with Archbishop Listecki, this is what we're asking of from the church. She said, when I was a Catholic kid, believe it or not, one of my favorite things to do was to go to confession, which most Catholic people don't like. It's one of the more stressful things for a kid. But she said, I'd go in there, I'd share what I did wrong, and yes, it was embarrassing and stressful. But when I walked out after being absolved, I felt so good again to get rid of all this stuff. She said so beautifully, it made me cry. She said, that's what we as victims are asking of you. Just get on your knees, air everything. Don't hold documents. Don't lie to us that that's going to help us. Get on your knees, ask for repentance, and you'll feel so much better. Your church will be, because of the clerical culture, because of control, power, pride, all of this, they simply cannot do that. Whether it's clergy sexual abuse, whether it's about lack of intimacy and people not being faithful to celibacy because they're what's called human beings, all of that stuff. So they lose their image. They're so fearful of that. And most importantly, that they would lose the power, the control, and the resources that are poured to them. That's what they're most afraid of.
I don't think the hierarchy have changed. They don't get it. Because if they got it, you wouldn't have things like Listecki refusing to cooperate. You wouldn't have the bishops spending tens of millions of dollars on lawyers to pound the victims into the ground.
I have very little confidence that the church has actually instituted real reforms to address abuse in its midst. I don't think they are serious about the reality of predators already active in very important places in dioceses and religious orders and in the Vatican. They aren't serious about confronting an organized block of predators in their midst and the bishops who cover up for them. And as much as they say that they've achieved so many great things, I think time will tell, because it takes people a long time to come forward about abuse. And so in the decades to come, we will learn more and more about what has been going on this entire time since 2002.
That's why they've been on the defensive for the past 38 years, because the victims have broken out of the deference. They've changed the whole approach. It's like one little guy getting in a bulldozer and going up against Mount Everest. But he keeps at it, and pretty soon Mount Everest starts to have a hole in the side. And that's made the difference. And that's why today, in 2022, it's drastically different than I imagined it ever would be when I got involved in this in '85. I never, ever thought I'd see some of the things I've seen.
I think if people are tired of this and want to make an impact, you're not going to overthrow the hierarchy. That's got to come within the institution. And that's why I'm so pessimistic. But if a normal layperson, like my mom and dad, Okay, I'll use them as an example. When they retired, they went to Mass every morning, who ushered parish councils, stewardship committees, baked for the bake sale. We're talking everything. They realized how little power, basically no power, they had over the situation I and all of us encountered. But what did my mom and dad decide to do? They sent their envelope back empty, okay, with big zeros on it, but they wrote why they weren't contributing, okay? That's what more people have to do. Have some guts, have some balls, and say, no more of this. I have many close friends who were parishioners of mine that are practicing Catholic. I've never tried to destroy their faith or participation in Catholicism, but I just know for myself and others I've talked to, especially with the issue of being sexually abused as a kid, my journey has had to move on, and it's taken me almost until now to become more outspoken because I still lived with that fear and a lot of just kind of blind respect and I can't rock the boat. But I just think there's a scripture that says, if to the one who's been given more is expected. I've met people that were sexually abused by priests who've taken their lives. They've ruined relationships they have. Their families don't want anything to do with them. And as much as I've gone through a lot of anguish, my story is one of survival. It's brought some wonderful people into my life. So I figure, hey, I've been given more, and I'm so far beyond some of this now that it's just time to speak out and be more of an advocate.